You mentioned certain values that you hold as you do the work that inform how you go about doing the education justice work. What strengths or qualities have you developed through your educational justice work, and how have they helped you navigate challenges?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a good question. You didn't script this one, in the form.
Nope. And like I said, there are a few, and some of them come up as follow-up questions too. I got another one actually that I want to ask you too, but if you can't speak to this one. So you're talking about the organization. So we were talking about that for a little bit. This one's kind of in a way returning to just you as a person, like what's sort of informing your
Mhm.
thing. What sort of things have you learned along the way or gained along the way in this work that helps you navigate challenges when it comes up? Just yourself and your own equity, leadership, or partnership with
Yeah.
other folks.
I've got one strength which I would think more about as a skill, if you
Okay.
will, and then one quality I think that's been an evolving kind of understanding for me. So I would say the strength is around facilitation, or the skill has been around facilitation. If you haven't had a chance, there's a wonderful book by Adrienne Murray Brown called Holding Change, and it's part of her emergent strategy kind of collection, but it's really a book for facilitators that talk about how do you hold the space for the conversations that we need to be having around social change, right? And I think that that's been a really critical skill for me to develop is like, how do you hold that space for folks, right? What do you have to let go of in the role of a facilitator? What do you have to welcome and cultivate for folks in that space? What are the things you need to account for, right? As it relates to power differentials or how people are situated or histories, right? Like all of that kind of stuff, I feel like has been, in order to be a good facilitator, you have to develop some emotional intelligence, read the room, right? Sense who's pulling back, who's stepping forward, who's leaning in, right? How do you solicit things from those that are maybe taking a back step? So there's lots of like ways in which you're consistently, and I'll say this, attending to the needs of the group, right? Which is a very different orientation for how we typically posture leadership, which is how does the group support the needs and desires of the leader, right? And so I would say that notion of quality of leadership for me has been the piece that's been consistently evolving over time. And I mentioned a little bit of my own personal history. I'm a straight, white facing, educated, middle class man in the social justice space. And leadership requires you to be conscious and reflective of how you are situated in all of these spaces. But the role of a facilitator, I think, so I think the role of a facilitator helps me in terms of my identity and how I'm postured to enter into a space in a way that doesn't allow all these other identity markers to drive the conversation for me. It positions me as as a learner and as a host more so than as an expert, which all of these other identity markers often push you towards. I would say the emerging kind of big piece that I'm wrestling with right now is like, I do have ideas. I feel like I have a perspective, and all those kind of things. And how do you learn, take that with understanding
Yeah.
why? But there is a role for that, right? It's for strong leadership, for leaders in our movement spaces, in our collective movement spaces. And so I think that the journey that I'm on right now is trying to wrestle with that a little bit, right? So what does that mean? It doesn't just mean that a leader should always be a facilitator that decenters their voice. There's a space for active leadership in this. But how do you do that? What does it look like? Those are, I think, questions I'm grappling with now.
Speaking of your own perspectives, what practices do you think are important for building sustainable and inclusive social justice movements? And how can others utilize, adopt, incorporate these practices? As I'm thinking about everything you've shared around your work with supporting people and building power and the
Mm,
example you use with the students, like there's some things that they did, there's some things that you do that kind of helps that process
yeah,
run. As messy, as complicated, again, I love how you say that, and I'm gonna say it right there with you. It's not saying that everybody is always on the same page. There are some conversations
mhm,
that are had. Like, to the degrees that you all are getting closer to the goals that you're setting for yourselves and getting
mm,
closer to getting what you want, in spite of these systems not being designed to give you that, to give us that, what are some things that you found helpful in that messiness that kind of
right,
sustains you all and sustains your work? Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So there's a couple things. I would say personal practice or like my own orientation to it, and then practice within the work. I would say my personal practice, one of the things that's been the most life-giving to me has been reading. And I'm the type, like I'm the nerdy type. This might not be your thing. Could be just podcast format. It could be videos. There's great documentaries and stuff like that about things. I dogged on learning a little bit in the beginning, but what learning has enabled for me is it puts words, it gives me a vocabulary for things that I'm often struggling with or for ideas that I think, oh yeah, I love that somebody else is already been thinking about. And so having and or maybe the practice for yourself then is working to build your own language, right? And the thing I think I love about learning, and this is my nerd self, is like I'm the kind of person that keeps a log of like all the words that I read for the first time that I didn't know the meaning of, right? And I'm like, oh, I want to figure out, and I was always taught like figure out how to use it in a sentence, like, kind of thing. And so similarly with the learning piece, it's like, it's not just about the learning, but it's like, how do you situate that within the work that you're doing? And I think that's the disconnect that is often the case between this pedagogical emphasis on like building your consciousness versus doing the work, right? I think those two things really need to go hand in hand. So if you're reading a ton, but you're not doing the stuff, right? If you don't have an applied idea of what this looks like, I encourage you to do that. Or if you're doing a lot of applied work, right? Sometimes we act out of these previous memories or the ways that we've been primed to do the work, like we've talked about. And so sometimes like broadening your reference library, as my friend Sammy Publis would say, is a really wonderful way to diversify your practice. So I would say that's been a really helpful thing for me. Yeah, I would say that the junction of learning and practice, right? That we shouldn't lose that. I think learning is also often very applied, if not more so applied than it is, cognitive in our sort of conscious brain.
Mhm.
Um, Practices as it relates to the work that has been really, really helpful for us. I think having really clear goals is something that we miss in the movement oftentimes. That, right, we're in an age right now where, we've been doing 10 years since BLM started. Black Lives Matter really kicked off in 2014 around Trayvon Martin's murder, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
we've been in 10 years, a decade now of mass mobilizations, mass protests, like mass stuff that has been really radicalizing for a lot of folks. But my local sort of critique of that here has been that we haven't had clear goals of what we want, what we're actually mobilizing around. And I mean achievable, concrete step goals, right, that are going to move us in the direction and the spaces to have the necessarily dialogue to disagree about those and come to some kind of collective agreement in the same way I talked about with students and the teachers union and stuff like that. Right. So it's like
Yeah.
these are not conversations where everybody's aligned necessarily, but they're conversations that we need to have. I'm not saying include like decision makers all the time in that, but I'm talking about from the movement
Yeah.
space, from the justice space, right? Like, how are we coming together, having the difficult conversations, creating some goals that we've agreed upon that we're going to move towards that are going to advance everybody's sort of collective agendas, right? So I think that's one piece that is really absent where we think about success as being around turnout, which is uh, as somebody who's trying to organize protests, turnout is huge and it's really high. But without some of those other pieces, I do think we miss some things, and or we run the risk of our conversations around racial justice just being conversations, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
They're not backed by any kind of teeth or power or plan to make a concrete difference in people's lives, which is absolutely necessary right now. People are hurting and we need to do something about it. So I think, yeah, that's one thing I would offer for that, the sort of the practical applied spaces. Like, what are our goals? And then what are the necessary processes that we're utilizing that push us to collect on those and to figure out what those need to be